my pleasure to introduce this morning Scott Graybiel from Calyx Corporation. Scott is the CEO of Calyx, a company out of Pasadena, California, that is working to commercialize perovskite technologies. Scott has a long history of being an executive at many energy-oriented companies. He was recently led the Flex Limited, a $2 billion division that works on solar energy and LEDs, and they became the third largest producer of PV modules outside of mainland China. And so he has a long history in energy-related companies, including semiconductors. Like he worked at many companies that people might know here: Applied Materials, General Electric, FECO, Oerlikon, et cetera, et cetera. One of the interesting parts in Scott's background is that he was a nuclear engineering officer in the Navy, and that's I think it's an interesting thing that I've observed, that many CEOs of companies actually worked on nuclear submarines, and I think that sort of real understanding of how you operate a team and a company. You might actually see that in Scott's presentation today, which really focuses on really how do you bring something from a very early stage into market readiness. And so with that, Scott, please take it away for us.
And Scott,
thank you very much.
Slides look good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you for inviting Calyx to this conversation. The title is a little bit of a mouthful, and I apologize for that in advance, but I think it encapsulates the crux of what we want to talk about today: is how do we apply various methodologies and put them together in such a way to help to support the development of perovskite products. And that's been something that we've worked hard on at Calyx. I want to start off and preface that everything I'm going to talk about today is really what we're learning and what works for us. And it's a synthesis of many different sources that I've picked up over the years, as well as the rest of the leadership team, on how do we best look at taking things from an early stage, going from lab to fab, as we like to say. So we'll start off by talking about what is frequently viewed as a common tension. There is a popular belief that speed and innovation is the antithesis of process, that if you have processes, they will slow you down. You won't be able to innovate at the pace that's necessary to keep up with competitors, deliver products on time to the market. And my argument is quite the opposite. My view is that you definitely need to have business processes that are effective in order to deliver on innovation. When people are polled in business or academia about what are those characteristics of innovative cultures, this is a pretty common list: high tolerance for failure, a willingness to experiment, psychologically safe, highly collaborative, and non-hierarchical or a flat organization, of really being the hallmarks of an innovative culture. But I would argue there's a better list, and this is not my list. This came from Harvard Business Review article written by Gary Pisano in 2019, but I think it captures it beautifully. There is a tolerance for failure, but no tolerance for incompetence. You know, if there's folks that aren't working out because of a lack of skill, to be innovative, you've got to be able to tease it out. That's a hard thing to say, but it is true. Willingness to experiment, but you have to be highly disciplined in those experiments. You have to be looking at your results, holding teams accountable, and understand what are you getting out of those results. And do, as my wife, who's a book editor, likes to say, kill your darlings. There may be aspects of what you're working on that are not going to bear fruit. That's where discipline comes in. And you need to have a framework to properly evaluate what is indeed contributing to your objectives and what isn't. I believe in being a psychologically safe organization, but also you have to be brutally candid. If things are not working out, people have got to have the ability to stand up and say, hey, this isn't working. We should try something else. And I could say that that's actually been reflected in our organization as well, where we've gone down a path that ultimately didn't work out. Great. Now, what are our options? What do we need to look at? And you have to listen to those around you. You may not necessarily execute on that suggestion, but having an organization that does listen to that input is important. Collaboration is key, but there has to be individual accountability to ensure that everybody is pulling their own weight. organizations can be flat. And I agree with this, that having a flat organization can be effective, but you have to have strong leadership to drive it. Now, what we'll focus on in today's talk is about those aspects of discipline, collaboration, individual accountability, strong leadership, but as a component to that leadership are management systems that can help guide an organization. And if they're properly tuned, they can run on autopilot. And you can leverage leadership to come in at the right points when needed to help make hard decisions or to try to pick up direction that an organization needs to go. But having a framework and a system in place makes that work a lot easier for everyone involved. So, but by their very nature, I want to highlight innovative cultures are paradoxical. Some of the things that we're talking about here do seem to be at odds with one another, but finding the balance between those two poles is important. So to go faster and more predictability, we need processes. And here's a few relationships I'd like to put out in front of you. And these are not mathematical. They're just ways to think about this. But focus is an incredibly important dimension of what we need to do in organizations that are dealing with technical challenges such that we deal with on a daily basis in this universe of perovskites. Focus is really a product of training, skill, and discipline. We hold training and training others as being a very important part, what we call one of our core principles in our company, teaching and training people. Do the people have the skill to be successful, and are they disciplined enough? And does the organization itself have the discipline to say, we're not going to pursue that particular market or direction, but we're going to pursue yet another? And all of us in the perovskite industry are going to be making these decisions at some point, whether or not you choose to look at space, for example, consumer devices. Are you just going to be completely on solar? Those are big strategic calls that can be distractions if they're not properly handled. You may defer some of those market entries. You may decide, okay, that may be core to what we want to get on today, but shifting gears too frequently, too often, taking on too much becomes that albatross around an organization's neck, where now you have too many things to do and cannot succeed. Processes is what keeps us on the road. It provides guidance when we're uncertain. And I think it provides guidance to the team. If there is a process that provides some mandated check-in or some discipline around, okay, I can go this direction and I know I can be confident in pursuing that direction, then that helps them be more effective, as opposed to having extremely wide boundaries, unlimited time, unlimited budget, which we know we're not in that universe. But nonetheless, having a tighter framework helps teams execute more confidently. But I look at process and focus as working closely together to deliver on execution. And again, a loose mathematical relationship. It's not real math here, but process and focus contribute to delivering. If you have zero process and a lot of focus, you're not going to execute. Likewise, if you're all process, no focus, you're not going to execute. But execution, repeated execution, does result in speed. And part of what we're talking about is establishing the frameworks to enable innovation and speed. And a simple way to think about it is like this. This is my old CEO from Flex, when he and I had a conversation about this a few years ago, about the philosophy of processes and why we have them, and what are good ones and what are bad ones. It's sort of like if you're driving down a road, and these are both mountainous roads, you certainly would feel a lot more confident driving down a paved road with guardrails, perhaps a little bit more quickly than you would going down a road that was not paved with no guardrails that you would drive off of a cliff. And that's a kind of thinking that I think is helpful. That's the visualization I think is helpful when you're looking at processes. Now, clearly having that road wouldn't be effective if there was a brick wall in the middle of it. So be conscientious when you're building these roads, you're building these frameworks, you're putting the guardrails up, that you're not blocking the road. You're still driving towards your objective. So this is the operating system that we use. And it's really composed of three building blocks: objectives and key results, being that overall framework for company-wide execution. What do we want to get done on an annual and a quarterly basis that are truly strategic in the outcome for the company? We try our best to try not make them subjective. And this is where it gets really hard when we sit with the leadership team and our team leaders and we talk about measurements. This is absolutely critical. I've seen OKRs in other organizations that don't have any sort of measurement to them, that I would say are these feel-good OKRs. Those aren't strategic. You have to be able to measure them. You have to be able to measure the impact on the organization. Otherwise, you need to really question, is this going to be a benefit? Is this going to deliver value to our shareholders? Is it going to deliver the product we need? Are we going to be compliant with various regulations, et cetera? But we also tie these to compensation, both on a quarterly as well as an annual basis. And I think that's important as well. I've been in organizations where they aren't, and I can tell you there is a difference in results. So that's something that we brought into it. Stage gate. Think about this as sort of that strategic framework for product development. This is very product focused, but it ensures that major requirements are met. And I'll talk a little bit about how that plays out for us in a later slide. And then Agile. This is the tactical framework for product development. It really is about aligning resources with daily work to accomplish bite-sized objectives. And this is where the speed and autonomy really come to fruition. And so my argument is this: with this nested framework, you can actually be quite a bit more effective. I don't think that one on its own can get the job done. I've seen over-reliance on Agile not be effective in the context of hardware. StageGate can be a little too stodgy without Agile, and OKRs by themselves, they're great, but they don't provide a framework. They can provide you what that ultimate goal and outcome is. So we view this as being a nested process. So annually, we establish annual OKRs, and every quarter, we establish quarterly OKRs, and they're measured through a sprint tracker. And our quarterly OKRs do mirror what our various sprints do, what our various Scrum teams, we call them project teams, do. And StageGate is that overall strategic framework for a product. Now, I'm not going to go into OKRs. There's a great book written by John Doerr, who was a founder over at Kleiner Perkins, and he's done a great job, and he has some great case studies in here. And what I like about his book, and I do recommend it, it does talk about different philosophies that other companies have adopted. He doesn't say this is the only way you can do it. He will talk about this is what worked for Google. This is what's worked for another company. This is what's worked for the Gates Foundation. And so it's a good overview, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Please do read it because we're a big believer in OKRs at KLX. So let me talk about StageGate. And what I've taken out, this table here comes out of our StageGate overview document, and we have 7 stages. I've seen organizations, when I was at Flex, we had like a 10 or 11 stage document because there was more minutia we had to try to capture given the nature of that business. That was a little bit longer, and that was what they referred to as a product development or solution development process. We brought it to 7. GE had 8, just as an example, but these seem to what fit best for where we are in the product that we're bringing to the market. But why do we do StageGate at all? Well, the rationale behind it is that it takes what can be a very complicated product development process and carves it up into much smaller chunks or stages. Every stage, think about it as, hey, you get through a stage, and now at the end of that stage, much like in this previous picture I showed, at the end of a stage, there's a gap. Well, that gap is the gate review. That is where you say, what did you get done in stage N? Great, let's talk about it. And there's a cross-functional team that's put together that represents finance, operations, R&D, management, with one decision maker. I do want to be clear about that, that can say, yes, you've passed the gate or not. It's a collaborative decision-making process. We believe in consultative decision-making, not consensus. So people can certainly voice their opinion, but one person needs to ultimately make the decision. But these gate reviews are important. And oftentimes you'll go through a stage gate or gate review, and you'll say, oh, gee, well, you didn't do enough on this one, but we may pass you to go to the next stage, provided that as a result of you getting a pass on this particular requirement in the stage, you've gone back and you've flushed out that point more clearly. And so we can keep a record of what's happening. And that's an important dimension of what StageGate is. All of our StageGate documentation is kept in a secure archive. And the reason why is that we want to have the ability to go back, look backward and say, gee, did we try that before? And if so, and if not, that will be helpful to know whether or not you've already gone down that path. And we've been in technical reviews, and they've been great discussions, and somebody say, hey, we should try X. Yeah, we did that 12 months ago and didn't work, and these are the reasons why. But that can't be tribal knowledge, because over time organizations grow in complexity and scope and scale. You have to have a repository for this kind of information to make sure you're not repeating the same mistakes twice. That's really important. That mistakes do happen. That's normal. Repeating the same mistake twice is not forgivable in my book. So you got to learn from your mistakes and move on. One of the key aspects of though is that you have to push responsibility down the lowest logical level. Product manager, for example, is accountable for managing the stage gate process, but the folks that get the job done are going to be individual team leaders that have certain aspects of that stage gate process that will be part of their nested framework in Agile to execute against. And it's not super complicated. It may sound a little complicated, but it isn't. Just to give you a sense, where we're sitting today as an organization is the stage gate 3, right? This pre-pilot development, right? Because we, like many of you, don't have the pilot equipment to do 2 square meters yet. Close, but not there. Now, and that's what's kind of preventing us to go from 3 to 4, just as an example, because once you get into stage gate 4, you start looking at engineering validation test, design validation test, and later subsequent phases about full product release, et cetera. But that's where we sit today. And probably a lot of you are there as well. One of the things I do want to warn you about is that stage gate can be very cumbersome. And so you really have to have an energetic management, energetic product manager in particular, that can help push these things forward. Management does have to stay involved. And I, for example, the way we've architected is that I chair these stage gate reviews considering the size of the organization. So that's just something we built into our process. It's not necessarily something that you have to have in yours, but it's just something that we've thought through, and particularly in the later stages. And the earlier stages, not so much. We decided to carve it up a little bit differently, but later stages, that's how we run things. But you have to stay involved. You can't just have this as your process and let it run. It's too much to deal with. Now, checklists are super key for this, and we've developed checklists for each of these stages. Everyone is a simple checklist, and it's the key thing when you're looking at stage gate. There's must-have criteria, there should-have criteria, and really it's must-have, should-have, and hey, are there gaps? And that's what we really try to capture here. So the must-meet criteria, you can't pass a gate unless you've done those things. Now, there could be dimensions of the should-have that you may or may not have accomplished, but it starts all the way at, hey, market feasibility. Is this thing going to work? And by going through a disciplined approach of this, we ourselves have kind of tweaked how we think about the downstream market. And that's helpful to just sit down and really look at what do the data say to us, even at the beginnings when you're thinking about the product, but all the way through. Product managers are empowered that they can skip steps. Common sense is encouraged, except for those must meet, unless it's an offshoot and there's some good reason, but they have to have a good reason. But the guidelines and requirements ensure that we don't miss things, that we've run enough evaluations, that we've met the appropriate test standards before we've graduated to that next level. But there is a single decision maker that would be the chair of these reviews that will make the decision, yes, you can pass, or no, you cannot. So that's fundamentally what we're looking at from stage gate. Now, what are some examples? Well, market research, as I touched on in the beginning, market research as well as monitoring. So that's also a key ingredient to this. Another example is, hey, we've said how many runs we need at a particular form factor before we'll go and spend money on a larger form factor, as an example. The simple results of durability tests. Having beta customers signed up, that's an important feature when you're looking at like stage gate 5. Okay, what are those requirements? You want to produce product that you can put in a customer's hands, and you have a specific agreement around that beta relationship and what they're going to do with said product, because as we all know, betas are your minimum viable product. There are going to be tweaks after you've gone through all of the evaluation by your customer and what's the nature of those relationships. And so we have a little bullet to document that, to ensure that we have beta customers engaged. An important dimension, incredibly important dimension, is this budget feedback loop. Now, today, it's not as onerous as it will be in the future. Today, we understand our run rate and our costs, and that's something we monitor, and we adjust budgets appropriately depending upon where we see things either going to spend more of or spend less of, etc. But one important dimension of this is that did you get data that actually affected your cost models? And for us, we recently did. So we said, great, how's that influence our cost model? Super, this is what we think it can do. But bringing your finance team into this discussion is incredibly important. And they have a vote here, because what you'll find, I've always had a very, very, very close relationship with my controllers and finance people, because they are your partners in helping you read the tea leaves a little bit differently. And many of you are probably like me, I can be a little bit optimistic. What I love about a strong finance person is that they are the pessimists. They're the ones to tell you your glass is half empty. And if you don't do this, this, and this, you're going to be in trouble. And listen to those folks. Oftentimes there's a tendency, I've seen it with some managers, well, they'll push that away and say, no, it's going to be fine. Trust me, listen to what they're saying. You may not agree with it. You'll arm wrestle over it, but ultimately you'll make a better decision as a result of that engagement. So when you're looking to build out your finance team, make sure you get people that will look at you and say, hey, the emperor has no clothes and your glass is half empty. Incredibly important. Here's another one that's seems like common sense, but you'd be shocked in terms of how often operations is not brought into the loop in terms of product changes. The marketing team is off doing what it's doing. The sales organization's got their KPIs set and they know what they need to sell. They've got their quotas, they're hitting the streets, they're talking, and the factory has no idea that there's going to be a transition. Or the supply chain has no idea that it's going to be transition. Oh, and by the way, boss, did you know that we have 10,000 of X that we've got to burn down? That's great. None of the customers are going to buy that version. These are the things this arm wrestling has to happen. This is particularly important at a later stage when you start talking about getting into beta sales and you start talking about your full product launch. And even end of life, it's even more critical. Too often our stage gate processes just dropped, at the end of life of product. Like if folks think, oh, that's done, we don't have to worry about that. Absolutely incorrect. You have to worry about it because that is a fiscal impact that you need to monitor and make sure that you ameliorate as you transition from one product to the next. And take it from me, the last people you want to inform are your salespeople. I have been a salesperson. All a salesperson wants to do is sell the next best version because that's going to help them crush in the market and get orders. That's what they're motivated to do. That's what you pay them for. They're coin operated. So they're probably the last folks that you want to say that we're going to have a cutover at this date to another. And I apologize to my sales friends if they're on this call, but that's the truth. Some criticisms of StageGate. It can be very documentation intensive. So do your best to streamline it. I'm a big believer, it doesn't need to look pretty, just get the right data on there and let's understand it, let's evaluate it. It can be slow. I've touched on this already. So this is why you need energetic product managers, energetic management to make sure it stays on track. The next is garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good information, good data, you can't make good decisions. You may graduate something too early, and just as bad is not graduating something to the next stage when it should be moving along. And that making sure that you've got good information and good data, that just comes with experience and training and asking the right questions. And it is true. I will say that too much structure can stifle innovation. If folks don't have enough of flexibility to execute against the requirements of the product, you are going to stifle innovation. But there is a fix for this. And I do think that Agile really does give StageGate wings. A lot of companies have struggled with the synthesis of these two things. And look, we still have our own challenges. I'm not going to say we've got it perfect yet. We don't, but we're conscientious of it. But finding ways to go and integrate these two philosophies, and let's look at them as philosophies together, can result in a much better product release process. But Agile takes a lot of those sins that have come out of previous project management philosophies like waterfall, like StageGate, and does energize it to an extent. But I'll share with you in a moment where it does have some weaknesses, where I think the combination of the two in the context of hardware is incredibly important. But let's talk about traditional Agile versus where I think it really applies in a hardware context. Traditional Agile can be very software focused. It is a counter, as I said, it's a counterweight to traditional project management systems that can be stifling. It does focus on individual over process, and that can be a good thing to sort of evaluate and to see how that fits in your overall system. There is a lot of vocabulary and formality. I'm a Six Sigma green belt. I grew up in that sort of framework. I was trained in StageGate and I became an adherent to Agile methodologies later in my career. But there's a lot of vocabulary and a lot of formality. And sometimes learning that language, it just becomes complicated. I don't think it serves a purpose. I agree. I understand why they've done it, because they wanted to create a common framework to span a software industry. But you can't be slaves to these systems. You got to figure out what works for you, measure, understand, get the feedback, incorporate it appropriately. It is very focused on customer, which is a good thing. And we too like to be very focused on what our customer requirements are. In software, it's a little bit more nuanced and can be much more complicated. I think in our world, we're fortunate that we do have an evolving set of standards and fundamental requirements. We know that developers want to see better IRRs. We know that they need to have products that can survive the environments in which they're going to be deployed. We know module companies have very strict requirements. So we have, I think, better defined frameworks than oftentimes you'll see in software, and that can be helpful. But in practice, Agile does result on I would say that, better put, there's a heavy reliance on over-the-air updates. Oh, we didn't quite get it right, so we're just going to go download a new patch. We don't have that luxury in our world. There is no patch that we can send to say, oh, okay, let's now improve the efficiency by X or improve durability by Y. We don't have that luxury. So we have to be more disciplined in the application of Agile than what the traditional framework would imply. So, and that's what I touched on when I talk about needs a stronger framework, because we do have a high cost of failure. In the hardware context, you'll find that the sprints are often longer than they are in Agile. And Agile will typically see a 1 to 3 week sprint, with maybe 2 being the average. In our world, it's quite a bit longer just because of what we're working on. And that's not uncommon in the framework of hardware. So we kind of look at sprints sometimes in a quarterly basis, but that's just how it works today. That will get faster as equipment comes online that can produce more results more quickly, but that's where we are today. It's easy to include certain aspects of the vocabulary, such as scrums, stand-ups, and retrospectives. We call them project stand-ups, and we have review meetings. But this is really, I think, a great element that comes out of Agile and having that discipline. It does force an alignment between tactics and strategy. Again, think about that overall strategy being your OKRs, your stage gate being your product strategy, execution roadmap, and then Agile being the tactics by which you're going to execute to that strategy. And I do feel that the combination of these two does offset some of what can be perceived stodginess, and sometimes real stodginess, unfortunately, with the stage gate process. But here are some examples in Perovskite. So, okay, we're characterize a sputter process and develop SPC controls and do X, Y, and Z with those controls, and try to have a CPK of, greater than 1.3, and et cetera, wherever you are. Create and execute DOEs to understand impact of lamination parameters on cell to module losses is another example. We build sprints around front end, back end, and durability. But I will say this, is the cadence is critical. There has to be an engagement where folks report out on the progress of their individual sprints, and our team leaders do that. And just here's an example of what we do. We have a large Perovskite panel project, we have a reliability project, and a tandem module project. And daily stand-ups by these team leaders with their respective cross-functional teams, and weekly reviews with me and the rest of the leadership team, they help support these projects. We don't let things lie. We make decisions and we move on. And that's what we try to do. We're not always successful, but that's when I find myself in those moments of trying to do a little bit of self-reflection. I go, oh, did we move fast enough on that? Did we have enough data to make the right decision? Those are the kinds of things I think about. And, I've caught myself even the last couple of weeks going, gee, you know what? We really should have moved faster on X, or we should have probably supported this a little bit differently than we had. But be open with yourself and know that, this is not it's a journey. So what do we get out of it? Look, it's not the only thing. Clearly, money helps, resources absolutely help. But when I think about these things, I think about the spending of time, talent, and treasure. We have finite amounts of all three of those things. I believe that these frameworks have helped us go a bit faster in some things. And this is some of the things that we've gotten out of it. And many of you are probably in the same spot, but this is what it's helped us do. It's really moved geometrically from relatively small form factors to something that's much larger. And by the end of this quarter, we'll be working on 14-inch by 16-inch, so 2-cell by 2-cell. But this is some work we've done for customers. This is an example of one of our cells. And this is pretty routine for us. We do everything on 6-inch and 8-inch on an edge substrates. There's very, very little that gets done in anything smaller. So it's 6 and 8 inches is all we work on today. And we've been able to generate a lot of hours of outdoor testing, which has been great. And this is just a snapshot of what we have here. We have relationships with the university. We have relationships with the testing lab that we work with, but this is what they're getting from us now. And that's been helpful. And it's really helped us understand a few things better, collect some data on things we don't quite understand, which is even better, because we want to continue to refine what our product ends up being. And having this framework in place really helps. But again, this is not, we're not there. And I don't think anybody can say that they're there. They've got all of their processes dialed in. The reality is you have to constantly be looking at things, measure yourself against how you're performing against your framework. Is your framework working for you? Are there things you need to adjust and tweak and tune? It is a windy road. Sometimes things are going great and sometimes they're not, but you have to be conscientious about, are you delivering against what you thought you could deliver against? And just being open and honest with yourself is absolutely key. So just in conclusion, I believe that innovation thrives best in a system. I think that by giving people a framework, they're free to execute more fluidly than they would otherwise. Giving somebody boundaries and saying, hey, that's not a bad thing, but just make sure we get this thing done. How we get there, I'm going to leave that to you. I'm going to tell you what we're going to have to accomplish in order to meet expectations of the market and our investors. I do think processes, if they're properly defined and tuned, can help you go faster with more confidence. And at the end of the day, that's what we need. But you need to have that constant monitoring and active management involvement. This is not fire and forget. You've got to make sure you're on top of it. Well, that's all I really wanted to cover today. So I think we're going to do some Q&A.